I was just finishing my usual evening meal of scrambled eggs and bacon and buttered toast when I heard the familiar sound of an engine in the yard. Through the kitchen window, I could see Colton's blue pickup parked just off the porch, just as he used to do when he was a kid in a hurry to get home from school. But now my son wasn't in a hurry. He sat at the wheel for a long time, clearly gathering his thoughts, and that alarmed me. At 74, I had learned to read people by their movements. 40 years as a city park ranger in Ocean View made it worth it. When you watch visitors every day, you could tell who was just out for a walk, who was looking for trouble, and who was obviously up to something serious. Colton was definitely in the latter category. I pushed my plate away and looked at the clock on the wall. It was 8:30 in the evening. My son usually came over on weekends, and not every weekend, but it was Wednesday, and his face looked like he was on his way to the dentist. I got up from the table, walked over to the sink, and started washing dishes looking out the window. Colton finally got out of the car, but he walked slowly toward the house, stopping as if he were thinking about something. In the last 6 months, he'd gotten stranger. He used to be able to come in for coffee, talk about his work as an electrician, complain about his customers, or brag that he'd gotten a good contract to wire a new house. Now he comes in, sits tense, answers one-word answers, and keeps glancing at his phone. I sinned on Felicity. She has always been the kind of woman who believes that the husband should spend all his free time with the family, not hanging around the relatives. I didn't accept Felicity right away. When Colton brought her over to meet her 5 years ago, she seemed too calculating. A pretty girl, yes, well-groomed, but there was something in her eyes as if she were constantly evaluating what was worth what. Ruth, my late wife, would probably have gotten along with her. Women understand each other better. But I never got used to the way Felicity looked at our house, at the furniture, at my old things. It was like she was figuring out what to throw away and what to keep. After the wedding, they moved into a small apartment in a new neighborhood in Ocean View, where all the houses were built to the same design and painted in the same pastel colors. Felicity worked as a receptionist in a dental clinic, earned good money, and then the family lived quite well. But she always wanted more. She was always talking about a house with a garden, a new car, vacation trips they couldn't afford yet. Colton went up to the veranda and knocked on the door. I grinned. He knows the door isn't locked, doesn't he? There's not much crime in Ocean View, especially in our neighborhood, where mostly retired people and middle-income families live. But knocking means the conversation will be formal. "Come on in. It's open," I called out, wiping my hands with a kitchen towel. Colton came in and went straight into the living room without even looking in the kitchen, though he usually sat at the table and waited for me to pour him coffee. Today he stood in the middle of the room with his hands behind his back, looking toward the fireplace. He was wearing a work jacket, jeans, and heavy boots. It looked like he'd come straight from the site. The living room looked exactly as it had 20 years ago. The same brown couch Ruth and I had picked out at the furniture store, the same coffee table with its worn surface that still showed mug marks and scratches from Colton's children's toys. Photos hung on the walls, our wedding, the birth of our son, his high school graduation, army pictures. Ruth had died 8 years ago, and I hadn't changed a thing about the house since. Why? I was comfortable, used to every single thing. "Dad, we need to have a serious talk," Colton said without turning to me. I walked into the living room and sat down in my favorite chair by the window. It was a chair I'd bought when Colton was in high school, and over the years, it had gotten the perfect shape to fit my body. The brown leather was scuffed on the armrests, but it was still comfortable to sit in. It was where I read the newspaper in the mornings, watched TV in the evenings, and where I thought about life after Ruth's death. "So what's there to talk about?" I asked, though I knew from my son's tone that I wasn't going to hear anything good. Colton finally turned to me. He's 35, but at this point he looked like a kid who broke his neighbor's window and now doesn't know how to tell his parents about it. Only boys are usually guilty, and Colton had a kind of stubbornness in his eyes, like he'd prepared himself for a scandal. "The thing is, Juniper's in trouble," he began, sitting down on the edge of the couch. "She divorced that type, and now she has nowhere to live with the kids. Juniper is Felicity's sister, 3 years younger than her. I met her at my son's wedding, and I knew right away she was a frivolous girl. Pretty, yes, but the kind of girl who thinks the whole world owes her a favor. Married some guy who sold used cars, had 2 kids with him, and then the trouble started. Colton would sometimes tell me what they were going through. Scandals, debts, drinking. Juniper's kids were loud and rude. A girl of about 10 and a boy of about 7 who ran around the house at family parties, touching everything and disobeying no one. Their father, the car salesman, was a typical hustler, smiling at everyone, telling jokes, and then it turned out he owed money to half the town. Juniper defended him until he started disappearing for weeks at a time and then moved in with some young salesgirl. So what? Let him look for an apartment, I replied. There's plenty of them for rent in town. What's she renting for? He doesn't pay child support, and she's been working as a store clerk for minimum wage. Colton rubbed his forehead with his hand. Felicity's really worried about her sister. Of course she does. Felicity had always been attached to Juniper, even though she was always causing trouble. She borrowed money and never paid it back, asked her to watch the kids for a weekend that turned into a week, or called in the middle of the night in tears complaining about her husband. Felicity would rush to her aid each time, and Colton would have to deal with the consequences. I knew where this conversation was going, but I kept quiet. Let him tell me what he wanted. The kids have been living in a motel for 2 weeks. It's not normal, Colton continued. And here you have this big house, 3 bedrooms, and you live alone. I live in my own house, I said calmly. Colton got up from the couch and paced around the living room. He was clearly nervous, rubbing his hands together, avoiding looking me in the eye. He used to act the same way when he was a teenager, when he wanted to ask me for money for something stupid, but then it was $10 or $20 for a movie or a toy. Now, Dad, don't be stubborn. We were thinking maybe it's time for you to look for something smaller. You know, an apartment not too far from here, so you'd be easier to manage, Colton said quickly, like he was afraid I'd interrupt him. And Juniper and the kids can stay here for a while until they get back on their feet. I looked at my son in silence. 35 years ago, I'd held him in my arms in this very living room when his mother, my late wife Ruth, brought him home from the hospital. Here he took his first steps. Here he learned to read. Here Ruth and I helped him with his homework. I spent the best years of my life in this house, and now my son suggests I move out to make room for strangers. Memory threw up a picture of Colton, about 6 years old, building a pillow fort in this same living room, while Ruth brought him a sandwich and a glass of milk. Then he got older, did his homework at the dining room table, and I helped him with math. In high school, he would bring his friends over, and they would play video games until late at night. Ruth always said our house was a place where kids felt safe. Are you serious, I asked. Very serious. Dad realized this is temporary, like a year, maybe a year and a half, until she finds a decent job and can rent a place. Colton leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. It'll be easier for you in an apartment, though. No yard, no cleaning. Heating isn't your concern. He sounded like he was doing me a favor, like it was up to me to figure out that it was time for me to make room for the young ones. I looked at his face and saw something new there, not just a request, but a demand. He had already decided how things should be and was now simply notifying me of the decision. And who's going to pay for this apartment? I clarified. Colton wrinkled his nose, rubbed the back of his head, looked out the window, then at the floor. I knew that gesture from when he was a kid. That's how he acted when he got caught lying, or when he asked for something completely impossible. Well, we thought you could sell the house. Enough money for a decent apartment and still have some left over, he said without looking me in the eye. So that was it. So not just moving, but selling. I bought this house in 1988 when Colton was 5 years old. It cost $23,000 and I paid the mortgage for 15 years. Now houses in our neighborhood sell for $250,000 to $300,000. Not bad money for a young family looking for a fresh start. I got up from my chair and went to the window. In the yard was an old oak tree that I had planted the year after I bought the house. It was now a powerful tree with a spreading crown. Under it were the garden chairs where I liked to sit on summer evenings with a mug of beer and a newspaper. Beyond the fence I could see the house of my neighbor Cora Farmer, whom we said hello to every morning when we went out to pick up the mail. It was a view I knew by heart. Every tree, every bush, every crack in the sidewalk. This is where my whole adult life had been. This is where Ruth died, where I learned to live alone, And now my son wants me to give it all up for his sister-in-law with kids who couldn't make a life of her own. No, I said without turning around. No to what? No, I'm not going to sell the house and move out to nowhere for your sister-in-law. I turned to my son. If she needs help, help her with money, get her a better job, but my house has nothing to do with it. Colton's face went rigid. I saw something new in his eyes. Not disappointment, not resentment, not hurt, but anger. Real anger, as if I'd refused to fulfill some obvious duty. Dad, we're not asking. We're offering a reasonable solution to the problem. He stood up from the couch. You're 74 years old. Why do you need such a big house? It's not like you even go upstairs anymore. It was a lie. I went upstairs every day. It was my workshop, where I fixed little things around the house and did wood carving. But I didn't argue. I like my house, I said simply. I saw Colton's jaw twitch, the same way it had twitched when he was a teenager, when I'd forbidden him something he'd considered an inalienable right. Back then, it was going to a friend's house for the weekend, or asking for money for new sneakers that cost like half my monthly salary. But now my 35-year-old son stood before me with the same stubborn expression on his face, and I felt uneasy. Dad, you don't understand the situation, he said, taking a step toward me. Juniper and the kids have been living in a motel for 2 weeks. Do you have any idea what it's like? 2 beds for 4, no kitchen, kids can't do their homework properly. I could imagine. But that didn't make Colton's suggestion any less absurd. Juniper's problems weren't yesterday, and she should be the one to solve them, not the one to put them on someone else's shoulders. I worked my whole life to buy this house, and I wasn't about to give it to just anyone. Let her go to social services, I replied. That's where they help people in difficult situations. Colton snorted. Social services? Dad, you're living in the last century. There are waiting lists for months, and the help is penniless. At most, they'll refer you to a homeless shelter. He paced the living room from corner to corner, waving his arms. His work boots tapped heavily on the parquet I had laid 20 years ago. My neighbor, an old carpenter, had helped me then, explaining how to fit the boards and what varnish to use. We worked for a month in the evenings, but the result was excellent. The parquet still looked as good as new, except for a couple of scratches that our cat had left behind. Did you ever think she might have a reason for this situation? I asked. Maybe you should have thought twice before having kids with an irresponsible type? Colton's face darkened. Are you seriously blaming the victim now? It's not Juniper's fault her husband turned out to be a scumbag. Victim? I couldn't help myself and grinned. Son, I saw that type at your wedding. It was clear within 5 minutes of conversation that he was nothing. But your Juniper thought she was really smart and didn't listen to anyone. It was true. At Colton and Felicity's wedding, this car salesman had been telling everyone about his big plans. He was going to open a car dealership or buy a plot of land and build an apartment complex or import auto parts. He didn't even have money for a decent suit. His jacket didn't fit well, and his shoes were obviously from a cheap store. Juniper listened to him with admiration, as if he were the most successful businessman in town. She loved him, Colton said. Loved his plans to get rich, I corrected. And when the plans didn't work out, the love ended quickly. Colton stopped and stared at me. You know, Dad, sometimes you can be very cruel. A woman with 2 kids left on the street and you're lecturing her about how she should have lived her life. I'm not lecturing. I just don't see why her problems should become my problems, I replied calmly. But Colton was already getting worked up and couldn't stop. Because we're a family. Because people need help sometimes. Because you have the opportunity to help and you're just being greedy. The word greedy hurt my ears. I haven't been greedy all my life. Worked 2 jobs to pay the mortgage on this house. Saved money for Colton's education, even though he ended up going into the Army and then learning to be an electrician through short courses. Helped him with the down payment on the apartment when he got married. And now I'm being accused of being greedy because I don't want to give my house to strangers. You think I'm greedy? I interjected. I think you're selfish, Colton blurted out, and immediately realized he'd said too much. We looked at each other in silence. The living room became very quiet, with only the ticking of the old wall clock and the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. A car drove by outside the window, and the sound of the engine seemed unnaturally loud. Selfish, I repeated slowly. I see. Colton rubbed his face with his hands. Dad, that's not what I meant. It's just that you don't realize how serious this is. Felicity cries every night because of her sister. She can't sleep well knowing the kids are living in a motel. Why aren't they living in your apartment? I asked. You have 2 bedrooms. We have a small apartment. It can fit 1 person at most, and Juniper has 2 kids. Colton started pacing the room again. Yeah, and the kids are noisy. We'll get kicked out by the neighbors. That was it. The kids are noisy, so let them make noise in my house. And I, therefore, am not entitled to peace of mind. At my 74 years old, I'm being asked to turn my house into a daycare center for other people's kids that even their own aunt can't tolerate in her apartment. Son, do you hear what you're saying? I sat back in my chair because my legs were getting absorbent cotton. You admit yourself that the kids are unruly, but you want to put them in my house. They're not unruly, they're just kids. Colton started to justify himself. Kids who broke my vase at Felicity's last birthday party, scattered soil from flower pots all over the porch, and drew on the wall in the hallway with felt-tip pens, I listed, and that's in 3 hours. That birthday party was a real challenge for me. Juniper brought the kids to visit and immediately disappeared into the kitchen, chatting with Felicity. The kids ran around the house like crazy, climbing into all the cabinets, turning the TV on and off, touching my tools in the workshop. When I tried to quiet them, the oldest girl claimed I was mean grandpa, and the youngest boy hid under the table and refused to come out. They're kids, Dad. They didn't do it on purpose. Colton spoke more and more quietly, realizing his arguments were sounding lame. Not on purpose, I agreed. Sarwan. But that doesn't change the outcome. I don't want someone painting on the walls, breaking furniture, and making a mess in my house. Colton stopped in the middle of the room and folded his arms across his chest. In that posture, he looked exactly like his mother in those moments when she was preparing for a serious conversation. Ruth used to do the same thing when she wanted to convince me of something important. Only she did it softly and naturally, while Colton looked threatening. Okay, Daddy, let's be blunt, he said stiffly. You live alone in a house that would fit a family of 5 comfortably. You have 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a large kitchen and living room. The house sits on a 1/4-acre lot. There's even a workshop in the garage that you hardly use. I do, I objected. Once a month planning a board, Colton brushed it off. Meanwhile, a family with kids is squatting in a motel and paying $100 a night. Do you realize that in a month they'll spend enough to put down a deposit on a decent apartment? He made it sound like I was obligated to deal with Juniper's financial problems, as if the fact that I had a big house automatically made me responsible for all of his wife's homeless relatives. That's their problem, I said. Our problems, Colton exploded. Felicity can't sleep well. She's constantly nervous, crying, blaming herself for not being able to help her sister. And I can't see my wife suffer. There it is, the truth. Not kids in a motel, not justice, not family solidarity. Just Felicity throwing tantrums at home, and Colton would do anything to make them stop. I understood that. Any man understands what it's like to live with a woman who makes a scene every day. But the solution had to be reasonable, not at the expense of third parties. Son, I understand this is hard for you, I said softer, but my house is not a solution to the problem. It's just a way of shifting the problem from one shoulder to another. From whose shoulders to whose shoulders? Colton was starting to get angry again. From the shoulders of a young woman with children to the shoulders of a retired man who has no responsibilities, no obligations. So at 74, I'm no longer entitled to my own life, my own habits, the peace of my own home. I must be willing to sacrifice all of that because I have no obligations. My commitments are my life, I said firmly, and I'm not going to break it for people who couldn't make their own. Colton looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time. His eyes read disappointment, anger, and something else, disdain. I wasn't sure, but I didn't like what I saw. You know what, Dad? He headed for the door. I thought you were a good man. All my life I thought you were. Turns out I was wrong. Those words hurt the most. Not the yelling, not the accusations of greed, but just that quiet disappointment. Colton spoke as if he had summarized our relationship and found it unsatisfying. Colton, wait, I said, but he was already heading for the exit. I have nothing to wait for, he replied without turning around. It's clear enough as it is. He reached the door, grabbed the handle, but then turned around. And you know what the saddest part is? Mom would never do that. She would find a way to help, even if it was inconvenient, and slammed the door so hard the panes in the windows shook. I remained seated in the chair, listening as the pickup's engine started and the car drove out of the yard with a squeal of tires. The living room seemed strangely empty and quiet after that conversation. Even the clock on the wall seemed to tick louder. I woke up at 7:30 in the morning, as usual. My body had gotten used to the regimen from the time I'd worked in the park, when I'd had to be there by 7 in the morning to check the condition of the paths after the night before, clean up the trash, and get everything ready for visitors. Now I didn't have to rush anywhere, but my internal clock kept running with the precision of a Swiss movement. I got up as usual and did a light exercise, bends, squats, stretching for my back. The doctor said that at my age it was important to keep the body in motion, otherwise the muscles would quickly atrophy. I was already feeling less mobile than I had 10 years ago, but I was still able to get around without a cane or other people's help. I showered, shaved, and dressed in my usual home clothes, a plaid shirt and old jeans. Went down to the kitchen and put on coffee. Outside the window, it was a gray October morning, typical of Ocean View this time of year. The sky was overcast, a chilly wind was blowing in from the sea, and it looked like it might start raining at any minute. Yesterday's conversation with Colton was still running through my mind, especially his last words about Mom. Ruth was indeed a gentler person than I was, but that didn't mean she let everyone get on her back. When it came to matters of principle, she could say no as well as I could. She just did it more diplomatically. I poured coffee into my favorite mug, the big, white, Best Daddy mug Colton had given me for my birthday 15 years ago. I sat down at the kitchen table and looked out the window at my yard. The oaks were starting to shed their leaves, and they were carpeting the grass. I'd have to rake them up this weekend, or the grass would turn yellow under them in the spring. The coffee was strong and bitter, just the way I liked it. Ruth always said I drank liquid resin, but I liked it just the way I liked it. Refreshing, with real coffee flavor, not instant water. I sipped slowly from the mug and thought about what I should do next. Colton would certainly cool down in a couple days. He had a temper in general, but he was resilient. When I was a kid, he could yell, slam the door, and an hour later he'd be sitting there talking about something like nothing had happened. The problem was that now Felicity was influencing him, and she was the kind of person who remembered grudges for a long time and didn't like to forgive. Maybe there was something he should have done to help Juniper. Not give her the house, of course, but find a compromise, like giving her money for a security deposit or helping her find a better job. I had a little savings, and I could spare a few $1,000s without hurting myself. Something told me that money would be wasted, though, and Juniper would be in a similar situation again in 6 months. I was finishing my coffee when I heard the sound of a car. I got up and walked to the window, expecting to see Colton's blue pickup. Maybe my son had come to his senses and apologized. But there was a car I didn't recognize in the yard, an old gray sedan that had seen a lot of use. People were getting out of the car, and I was surprised to recognize Juniper. She looked tired and worn out. Her hair was in a sloppy ponytail. She wore no makeup on her face, and she was dressed in crumpled jeans and an old jacket. Behind her, the children got out of the car. A girl of about 10 in a school uniform, and a boy of about 7 in a tracksuit. The kids didn't look well-groomed either, especially the boy, whose hair was sticking out in different directions. I didn't understand what they were doing in my yard at 8 in the morning. Maybe Colton had decided to talk to me again after all, and brought Juniper over to explain the situation to me. It seemed odd, though. People didn't usually bring their kids over for serious conversations. Juniper went to the back door of the car and started pulling suitcases out of there. Lots of suitcases, and boxes, and bags of stuff. The kids grabbed some bags too and headed toward the house. Only then did it dawn on me what was going on. I ran out of the kitchen and rushed to the front door. I opened it with a jerk and saw that my things were already on the porch. My old suitcase that I hadn't taken out in about 10 years. A box of papers from the home office. A bag of clothes. Another box with my books sticking out of it. "What's going on here?" I shouted, but Juniper didn't even look in my direction. She continued to unload her stuff from the car, and the kids were already coming up the porch steps with bags in hand. The girl was carrying a backpack and some kind of toy box. The boy was dragging a gym bag that was clearly too heavy for him. Juniper, explain what's going on here, I repeated louder. She finally turned around. Her face was tired but determined. No awkwardness or embarrassment, as if what was happening was perfectly normal. We're moving, she said briefly and turned back to the car again. Moving to where? I stepped down from the porch and walked over to her. This is my house. Colton said you had a deal, Juniper replied, pulling another box out of the trunk. That you'd move into an apartment and we'd live here temporarily. I felt the ground go from under my feet. Did Colton seriously think that after last night's conversation, I would take him up on his offer? Or had he decided to set me straight? We didn't agree on anything. I tried to take the box from Juniper's hands, but she yanked her hands away. I absolutely refused to do that. Then you need to deal with Colton, she said indifferently. And I need to get the kids settled. They're going to be late for school. The children had indeed already tried the front door, but it was locked. The girl pulled the handle a few times, then turned to her mother. Mom, the door won't open. We'll open it now, Juniper replied and reached into her pocket for the keys. Keys. She had the keys to my house. Where did you get the keys? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Colton gave them. Juniper walked up on the porch, pushed my boxes aside, and stuck a key in the keyhole. The key didn't fit. Juniper tried again, twisted the key around, but the lock wouldn't open. She pulled out another key, tried it, but the result was the same. That's odd, she muttered. Colton said he changed the locks, but the keys should fit. Change the locks. So yesterday after we talked, my son came here and changed the locks on my own house. Without my permission, without warning, he just did it. I reached into my pocket for my keys, even though I knew they wouldn't fit. Indeed, my key wouldn't even fit in the keyhole. The lock was different. New. Shiny. At that moment, my cell phone rang. The name on the screen read, Colton. I answered it without even saying hello. What did you do? Hey, Dad. My son's voice sounded calm, even cheerful. What's up? Colton, I've got strangers standing in my yard with stuff, and my stuff has been thrown out on the porch. Not strangers, but Juniper and the kids, Colton corrected. And nothing's thrown out, just moved. Carefully moved. I couldn't believe my ears. My son sounded like something completely normal had happened, like he was just reporting a furniture rearrangement. Do you realize what you're doing? I yelled into the phone. This is my house. You had no right to change the locks. I did, Colton replied calmly. The house belongs to me now. I kicked you out, Dad. Don't come back again. And he disconnected. I stood with the phone in my hand, unable to believe what I'd heard. The house belongs to me now. I kicked you out. How was that possible? The house is in my name. I have the deeds. I pay all the bills. No one can just kick me off my property. Juniper, meanwhile, walked around the house and found a window that wasn't locked. It was a small window in the back room that I sometimes left ajar for ventilation. She squeezed through it, and a minute later the front door opened from the inside. Well, finally, she said, and began to bring things into the house. The kids happily ran inside, leaving their bags in the hallway. I could hear them scurrying around the rooms, opening doors, turning on lights. The boy was yelling something about finding a TV. The girl was asking where her room would be. Stop! I shouted, walking up the steps. Get out of my house! Uncle Elmer, don't yell at the kids, Juniper said, blocking my way. They're not doing anything wrong. Uncle Elmer, I interjected. I'm not your uncle, and this is my house, not yours. Look, Juniper set the box on the floor and looked at me seriously. I realize you're not used to this, but Colton explained the situation. You'll be better off in the apartment, and we need a place to live. Let's not make a scene in front of the kids. She talked to me like I was a cranky old man who needed to be calmed down and sent to bed. Like I was the one who was being unreasonable, not her, who was breaking into someone else's house with kids in suitcases. Get out, I said as calmly as possible. Get your stuff and get out, now. I won't, Juniper replied. I have nowhere to go with the kids. That's not my problem. It's yours now. She picked up the box again and went into the house. Colton said it's best for everyone. I was left standing on the porch among my things, not knowing what to do. In my mind, I couldn't comprehend what was happening. How could this be possible in a civilized country? How could you just take a man out of his own home? Our neighbor, Cora Farmer, was watering the flowers in the front garden, and looked curiously in our direction. She must have heard the screams and wanted to know what was going on. Cora had lived in the neighborhood for 20 years, and we'd always maintained a good relationship. She was a couple years younger than me, a widow, and her children lived in other states and rarely came to visit. I grabbed my suitcase and headed over to her place. Cora Farmer met me at the gate with an expression of genuine concern on her face. She was 72, but she looked younger than her years, slim, with neatly styled gray hair and lively brown eyes. She was dressed in practical jeans and a plaid shirt, wearing gardening gloves. In her left hand she held a watering can, which she used to water the chrysanthemums along the fence. "Elmer, what's going on?" she asked, taking off her gloves. "I heard screaming, saw some people outside your house." I set my suitcase on the ground and rubbed my forehead with my hand. My head was buzzing from everything that was happening, and I still couldn't believe the reality of the situation. Just last night, I was having a quiet dinner in my kitchen, and this morning I'm standing with my suitcase at my neighbor's house, kicked out of my own home. "My son decided it was time for me to move out," I said, trying to sound calm. "Change the locks and put his wife's in-laws in the house." Cora opened the gate and gestured for me to come in. "Come on in and tell me all about it. I'm just putting on the coffee." Her yard was a model of order and comfort. All the paths were neatly tiled, the flower beds framed by a low decorative fence, every plant in its place. Cora had always been pedantic in matters of beautification, and this quality helped her to keep the plot in perfect condition. On the veranda were wicker chairs with soft cushions and a small table where garden magazines and reading glasses lay. We walked up to the veranda, and Cora pointed to a chair for me. "Sit down, Elmer. I'll get the coffee, and you can tell me all about it." I sat down and looked toward my house. There were voices and noises coming from there. Apparently Juniper and the children were settling in. A child's figure flashed through a second-story window, then another. They were exploring the rooms, picking out places to live in a house that hadn't been built for them. Cora returned with a tray containing 2 mugs of coffee, a sugar bowl, and a small plate of cookies. The coffee smelled of vanilla and cinnamon. Cora liked to add spices, saying it made the drink more flavorful and warming. "So tell me about it," she said, settling into a nearby chair. "What's up?" "I started with Colton's visit yesterday, told her about Juniper, about her problems, about her son's offer to sell the house and move into an apartment." Cora listened attentively, nodding occasionally but not interrupting. When I got to the morning's events, she frowned. "Wait a minute, Elmer. They just picked the locks and changed them? Without your consent?" "That's exactly right," I confirmed. "And when I called Colton, he said he kicked me out and the house belongs to him now." Cora set her mug aside and shook her head. "That's impossible. The house is in your name, isn't it? The deeds, the title, everything is in your name." "Of course," I replied. "I bought this house in '80s, paid off the mortgage for 15 years. I have all the papers in my safe. I mean, were in the safe." Suddenly it hit me. The documents were still in the house, in the safe that stood in the home office on the first floor. True, I had copies in the safe deposit box, but the originals were lying where Juniper and the children now resided. "Elmer, do you realize what's happened?" Cora leaned forward. "You were simply kicked out of your own home illegally. That's a crime." "But how is that possible?" And I asked. "I mean, Colton is my son. He can't just take my house away from me." "He can if you let him," Cora said stiffly. "Kinship doesn't give anyone the right to break the law. Even if Colton was registered in the house, even if he had a stake in the property, he couldn't kick you out without a court order." I finished my coffee, feeling my ability to think straight slowly return. The shock of the morning's events was starting to wear off, and anger was replacing confusion. Yes, Colton is my son, but that doesn't give him the right to treat me like a helpless old man. "And what do you think of his saying that the house belongs to him now?" I asked. "Maybe there are some papers I don't remember," Cora wondered. "You never executed a deed of gift? Never signed any paperwork transferring ownership?" "No, of course not," I answered confidently. "Why would I gift the house during my lifetime? It's already going to Colton when I die." "Is there a will?" "There is, drawn up 3 years ago at the notary's. But it simply states that all the property goes to my son. No change in ownership during my lifetime." Cora stood up and walked across the veranda. She was clearly considering something, and I could see her mind working. Cora had worked in a bank for 30 years before she retired, the last 10 years as a deputy director, so she was pretty well versed in legal and financial matters. "Elmer, does Colton have access to your bank accounts?" she asked. "Power of attorney to manage your finances?" I tried to remember. After Ruth died, there had been a lot of formalities, paperwork that had to be reissued. Colton had been a big help then, taking me through the paperwork, explaining what to sign where. "There's a power of attorney in case I'm unable to manage things," I said slowly. "Formed just in case for old age. But it's only valid if I'm recognized as incapacitated." "And who's supposed to recognize that?" "Doctors. The court. I don't remember exactly. But I'm legally capable. There's nothing wrong with me." Cora returned to her chair and looked at me seriously. "Elmer, maybe Colton thinks he can use that power of attorney, or he has some other documents that he's interpreting in his own way. But either way, what he did is illegal." From the house across the street came children's laughter and the sound of a working television. Juniper had apparently turned on the cartoon so the children wouldn't disturb her as she sorted out her things. How quickly they settled into someone else's home, how easily they took the situation for granted. "What should I do?" I asked. "Call the police?" Cora shook her head. "The police aren't likely to help. It's a family dispute, plus there are children there. The cops won't kick a woman and her kids out into the street without a court order, especially if she claims she has a right to be there." "So a court of law?" "Yes, but we need to consult a lawyer first." Cora pulled her phone out of her pocket. "I have the number of a good lawyer, Blaine Collins. He specializes in property disputes, helped me when I sold the summer house." She found the number in her contacts and showed me. "Call him right now. Explain the situation. Ask for an urgent meeting." I picked up the phone and dialed the number. The phone was picked up after the third ring. "Collins Law Office is speaking." "Hello, my name is Elmer Rigsby. I need immediate counseling regarding an illegal eviction from my own home," I said, trying to speak clearly and to the point. "One moment, connecting to Mr. Collins," a female voice answered. A few seconds later, a man with a deep, confident voice picked up. "Blaine Collins. What's the problem, Mr. Rigsby?" I briefly outlined the nature of the situation. Collins listened silently, occasionally asking clarifying questions about the deeds to the house, the power of attorney, whether there were any witnesses to what had happened. "I see," he said at last. "The situation is serious, but solvable. Can you come to my office in an hour? I need to see the documents and go over the circumstances in detail." "Sure," I agreed. "Where is your office?" He gave an address downtown near the courthouse. I wrote it down on a napkin and hung up. "So?" Cora asked. "Meeting in an hour," I replied. "Cora, thank you so much. I don't know what I would have done without your help." "You're welcome, Elmer," she patted my shoulder. "We've been neighbors for 20 years. How could I not help? Besides, what your son is doing is outrageous." I was relieved by her words. At least one person saw the situation the same way I did, understood that what had happened was wrong. I was beginning to doubt my own adequacy. Maybe it was time to go to a nursing home, since my own son considered me a burden. "And where will you live in the meantime?" Cora asked. "Until the house issue is resolved?" I hadn't thought about it. It had all happened so fast that I hadn't had time to figure out where I was going to spend the night. A motel? Expensive and uncomfortable? Other relatives? But there were hardly any. Ruth was the only child in the family, and my parents and brother were long dead. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "Stay at my place," Cora suggested without hesitation. "Chef Chobrain. I have a guest room and could use the company. After Robert's death, the house seems too quiet." Robert had been her husband, dying 4 years ago of cancer. Cora took the loss hard, but held herself with dignity, not complaining or asking for pity. Ruth and I tried to support her as best we could at the time. I helped with repairs and yard cleanup. Ruth cooked lunches and brought them to her. "Cora, I can't abuse your kindness," I began. "No abuse," she interrupted. "I'll really enjoy having someone else in the house, and you'll help me with minor repairs and heavy housework. Mutual benefit." I thought about it and realized that I really had no other option. Besides, Cora's right. We've known each other for years, and a few days of visiting wouldn't pose a problem. "Okay," I agreed, "but only until I get my house back." "Deal," Cora smiled. "Now go see a lawyer. The sooner you start acting, the sooner this will be resolved." I stood up, grabbed my suitcase, and headed to my car. It was quiet in my front yard. Apparently Juniper and the kids had gone about their business. Or maybe they'd just gotten comfortable and weren't making any more noise. As I got into the car, I felt a surge of determination. Yes, something unimaginable had happened, but I wasn't going to give up. The house is mine. The deeds prove it, and no one has the right to kick me off my property. Not even my son. Colin's law office was on the third floor of an old brick building in downtown Ocean View, built back in the 50s. The elevator was ancient and noisy, but it worked properly. The hallway smelled of old wood and lemon air freshener. The walls were painted a calm beige color, and the floor had practical gray tiles. I found the right door with a sign that read Blaine Collins, Attorney at Law, and walked into the reception area. Behind the counter sat a middle-aged woman in a strict suit who looked up from her computer and smiled. "Mr. Rigsby, Mr. Collins is expecting you. Please come into the office." She pointed to the door on the right and I knocked before entering. A voice from inside gave permission to enter, and I found myself in a spacious office with large windows overlooking the main street of the town. Behind a massive wooden desk sat a man in his 50s with neatly trimmed gray hair and attentive blue eyes. Blaine Collins stood up to say hello. He was tall in a well-fitting gray suit, looking professional and confident. On the desk was a picture of a woman with 2 children, stacks of papers, and several legal reference books. "Have a seat, Mr. Rigsby," he said, pointing to a leather chair across the desk. "You said on the phone that you were illegally evicted from your own home. Tell me more about it." I sat down and began to tell from the beginning. About Colton's visit, about his offer to sell the house, about last night's argument, and about what had happened this morning. Collins listened attentively, occasionally making notes in his notebook, sometimes asking clarifying questions. "So your son claims the house now belongs to him," the lawyer said when I had finished. "What is the basis for that claim? Does he have any documentation?" "I don't know," I admitted. "On the phone, he just said the house was his, that's all. No details." "Do you have any title deeds?" I pulled a folder from my inside jacket pocket with copies of the deeds I kept in a safety deposit box just for such an occasion. Ruth always said that copies of important papers should be in a safe place, separate from the originals. Collins scrutinized the documents. The deed to the house dated 1980, the certificate of full payment of the mortgage, the certificate of title, the extract from the real estate register. Everything was in my name. There could be no doubt about it. "The papers are in order," he said at last. "You are the sole owner of the house, that's undeniable. Now tell me about the power of attorney that was executed in your son's name." I told him how, after Ruth's death, Colton and I had gone to a notary public and executed a power of attorney in case I became incapacitated. It seemed like a sensible precaution at the time. If something happened to me, my son could handle financial matters, pay bills, sell the house, if necessary, put me in a nursing home. "Do you have a copy of that power of attorney?" Collins asked. "Yes, here." I pulled another document out of the folder. The attorney studied the power of attorney, nodding occasionally. "I see. The power of attorney does give your son broad powers, but only if you are declared incapacitated by a medical board in a court order. As long as you are legally capable, this power of attorney is null and void." "But Colton might not have understood these subtleties?" "Could have," Collins agreed. "A lot of people are not well versed in legal nuances. He may think the power of attorney gives him the right to dispose of your property right now, but it doesn't." Collins leaned back in his chair and folded his arms across his chest. "Mr. Rigsby, the situation is legally very simple. You have been unlawfully denied access to your property. It's called vigilantism and is an administrative and, in some cases, criminal offense." "So we can sue?" "Not only can, but we should," the lawyer said firmly. "We have 2 ways. The first is to file an unlawful occupation of the dwelling and demand immediate release. The second is to try to resolve the matter peacefully through negotiations." I thought about the second option. After yesterday's conversation and today's events, it didn't seem to me that Colton was ready to negotiate. He had made a decision and acted without regard for my opinion. What would negotiation change? "What if it doesn't work out peacefully?" I asked. "Then we go to court." Collins pulled some forms of paperwork from his desk. "In your case, it will be a lawsuit to restore the violated right of possession and use of residential premises. The requirements are simple. Recognize the defendant's actions as unlawful, Order them to vacate the premises and compensate for the damage caused. What damage? Moral harm, expenses for temporary housing, legal services. Plus, if they damage anything in the house, property damage as well. Collins began filling out the claim form, occasionally asking me for details. The exact address of the house, Colton and Juniper's information, dates of events. His secretary brought coffee and cookies, but I barely touched the treat. My nerves were on edge. How long will the trial take? I asked. Not long under these obvious circumstances, Collins replied. We file the papers tomorrow morning. The judge will schedule a hearing within a week. It's an urgent case. A man has been foreclosed on. He continued writing, carefully phrasing each point of the lawsuit. I looked out the window at the street, where people went about their business leisurely, and thought about how quickly life can change. A week ago, I was just an ordinary retiree who spent his days in his house, gardening and workshop, reading books and watching TV. Today, I'm sitting in a lawyer's office preparing a lawsuit against my own son. Mr. Rigsby, there is one important question, Colin said, lifting his head from the papers. Are you sure you want to sue your son? It's a serious step that could permanently damage your relationship, I wondered. Indeed, a lawsuit is not a family quarrel that can be hushed up. It's a public trial that will remain on the record and in people's memories. After the trial, our relationship with Colton might never recover. Are there other options? I asked. You can try talking to him again, explain that his actions are illegal, or ask someone you know in common to mediate, the lawyer suggested. But if he won't make contact, then a trial is the only way to get your house back. I imagined staying at Cora's for weeks, maybe months, while Juniper and the kids settled into my house. How they would use my stuff, sleep in my bed, cook in my kitchen. How Colton will think he's right and I'm a stubborn old man who doesn't understand the realities of life. File a lawsuit, I said firmly. I'm not going to put up with being kicked out of my own home. Collins nodded and continued filling out the paperwork. Half an hour later, the statement of claim was ready. The lawyer explained to me all the formalities. Tomorrow morning, he would file the papers with the court. Within 3 days, they should be reviewed and a hearing date set. The defendants, Colton and Juniper, would be sent summonses and would be required to appear in court to give explanations. What if they don't show up? I asked. The court can decide without their attendance if their absence is unreasonable, Collins explained. And in your case, that's even better. Less emotion, faster process. He quoted the cost of his services. The sum was substantial, but not critical. I could afford to pay for a lawyer's work without sacrificing my life. Besides, if the court satisfies the claim, the defendants will be obliged to reimburse the court expenses. There's one more thing, Collins said when we were done with the paperwork. It's advisable to document the current condition of the house. If the defendants damage or break something, you'll have a hard time proving it. How do I fix it if they won't let me in? You can ask the neighborhood police officer to draw up a report of the inspection, the lawyer suggested, or hire an independent appraiser to document the condition of the property. We agreed that Collins would contact the precinct police officer and ask him to go to the house to make a report. It wasn't necessary, but it might come in handy if Juniper and the kids did any damage. When all the formalities were settled, I felt a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. On the one hand, the case had moved forward. Tomorrow, the documents would be filed with the court, and the mechanism of justice would begin to work. On the other hand, I had finally crossed the Rubicon in my relationship with my son. Mr. Rigsby, Collins said as he escorted me to the door, don't question the propriety of your actions. No one has the right to kick you out of your own home, not even close relatives. The law's on your side. His words cheered me up. Yes, the situation is unpleasant, but I am doing the right thing. I'm not a vindictive person, and I don't want to hurt Colton, but I'm not going to let him violate my rights with impunity. When I left the office, I got into my car and just sat there for a while, gathering my thoughts. There was the usual city bustle outside, people walking on the sidewalks, cars passing by, stores running. Normal life, where everyone has the right to their own home and to be protected from arbitrary behavior. Tomorrow the trial begins. Tomorrow my own son will receive a summons and find out that I have sued him. I wonder what he will think then. Will he realize he's gone too far? Or will he think I'm completely out of my mind? Time will tell. The first call from Colton came the next day at 2:30 in the afternoon. I was just helping Cora transplant the chrysanthemums in the front garden when the phone rang. My son's name popped up on the screen, and I thought for a second about whether or not to answer, but curiosity took over. "Dad, is it true?" Colton's voice sounded confused. "I just got some kind of subpoena. It says you're suing me." I stuck my trowel into the ground and straightened up. My back ached. I'd had a lot of nervousness the last few days, and it was taking its toll on old sores. Cora delicately stepped back to another flower bed, pretending not to listen to the conversation. "True," I answered briefly. "But how? Why? Dad, we're family." Colton spoke quickly, agitated. "Couldn't we have resolved this the family way?" "Family friendly is when they ask permission before kicking you out of the house," I said calmly. "Not when you're confronted with the fact." A woman's voice came over the line. Apparently Felicity was nearby, and she was saying something to Colton. He covered the phone with his hand, but I could still hear bits of phrase. "Told you. Too harsh. Now you're on your own." "Dad, listen." Colton spoke into the phone again. "I understand that you're upset. I may have rushed into a decision, but we can discuss things calmly without courts and lawyers." "Discuss what?" I interjected. "You've already decided everything. You changed the locks. You put strangers in my house. You claimed it was yours. What is there to talk about? A house is not a stranger's house. Juniper is family. It's Felicity's sister." Colton's voice was getting more and more tense. "And I didn't say the house was mine. I just thought it was best for everyone." It was interesting how quickly his version of events had changed. Yesterday, he clearly said, "I own the house now." And today it turned into, "thought it was best." Upon receiving the subpoena, Colton clearly began to realize the gravity of the situation. "Better for whom?" I asked. "It's certainly not better for me to sit at my neighbor's house instead of my own house." "Dad, is it really that hard for you to help a family in a difficult situation?" Colton's voice took on a pleading tone. "It's only temporary, just for a year and a half." "Son, can you hear yourself?" I felt the anger rising again. "You kicked me out of the house, and now you're asking me to step in? Where was your concern for me when you changed the locks?" Cautious footsteps were heard behind her. Cora stepped closer, apparently worried about the course of the conversation. She knew about the lawsuit that had been filed and fully supported my decision, but she was still worried about how the family would react. "I thought you'd understand," Colton said more quietly. "We didn't mean to hurt you. It's just that the situation is critical. The kids are living in a motel." "The kids are living in a motel because of their parents," I interrupted, "and it's up to their parents to solve that problem, not me." The woman's voice came again, louder and more insistent this time. Colton covered the receiver again, but the conversation could be heard. "Tell him about the kids. He's a grandfather. He should understand." "Felicity wants to talk to you," Colton said. "I don't want to," I answered immediately. "Dad, please, at least hear her out." Before I could object, Felicity picked up the phone. Her voice sounded soft, almost pleading. "Elmer, hello. I'm sorry about the way things turned out. We really didn't mean to upset you." "Felicity, your apology doesn't change anything," I said. "The fact remains that I've been kicked out of my own home." "But it's only temporary." There was insistence in her voice. "And the house is empty for nothing, and the children are tormented in a motel. Don't you feel sorry for them?" There it was, Felicity's favorite tactic, to press her emotions, to appeal to her conscience. The children were indeed pitiful, but not so pitiful as to give them their home. "I feel sorry for all the children in the world who live in poor conditions," I replied, "but I don't have to solve their problems at the expense of my own comfort." "Elmer, you do realize we're a family, right?" Felicity was changing tactics. "A family is supposed to help each other in times of need. Your wife, heaven rest her soul, would probably have acted differently." The mention of Ruth struck a nerve. Yes, Ruth was a kind person, but that didn't mean she let everyone get in her way. And she certainly wouldn't let herself be kicked out of her own home. "Don't you dare speculate about what my wife would do," I said stiffly. "You never really knew her." "But I do know she loved her family above all else." Felicity didn't give up. "And she wouldn't have sued her own son." "Ruth wouldn't have had to sue because her son wouldn't have kicked her out of the house," I parried. A quiet altercation between Colton and Felicity could be heard over the line. She was clearly unhappy with the way the conversation was going, and he was trying to calm her down. After a minute, Colton picked up the phone again. "Dad, let's get together and talk about this calmly. Maybe we can find a compromise." "What kind of compromise?" I asked. "You vacate my house and I'll take the lawsuit. There can be no other compromise." What if, what if we find you a nice apartment, close to downtown with an elevator so you'd be comfortable?" Colton spoke cautiously, groping for ground. "At whose expense?" "We'll help with the move, with settling in." "Son, you're missing the point again." I felt tired of this conversation. "This isn't about the apartment. It's about you treating me like a thing that can be moved from place to place at will." "That's not what I thought." "It doesn't matter how you thought. It matters what you did," I interrupted. "And now let the court decide who's right." I disconnected and turned the sound off just in case. Cora came up to me with a look of concern on her face. "How did the conversation go?" "As expected," I replied, wiping my hands on an old towel. "Colton doesn't realize the gravity of the situation. He thinks it can be resolved through negotiation and compromise." "What did he offer?" "Find me a better apartment. Help me move. Anything to keep his sister-in-law out of my house." The rest of the day went smoothly. Cora and I finished work in the garden, cooked dinner, and watched the news on TV. But around 8 in the evening, the calls resumed. First Colton again, then Felicity. I didn't answer, but they kept calling every half hour. The next day, the story repeated itself. Morning call from Colton, afternoon call from Felicity, evening call from Colton again. They'd obviously agreed to take turns, hoping to wear me down. Felicity was especially diligent, talking about how hard it was on the kids, how Juniper cried at night, how it was all affecting the family atmosphere. "Elmer, don't you realize you're destroying the family?" she said during one of the calls. "Colton is constantly stressed out. I can't work in peace. The kids feel the tension. And all because of what? Because you don't want to squeeze in for a while?" "Squeeze in?" I couldn't stand it. "I've been kicked out of my own home and you call that squeezing in?" "Well, not kicked out, but asked to temporarily make room for people who need it more than you do." Felicity tried to speak softly, but irritation slipped into her voice. "Asked?" I laughed. Interesting wording for changing the locks and throwing my stuff on the porch. "Elmer, you're exaggerating everything." "I'm not exaggerating anything. I'm stating facts. And the overriding fact is that your family violated my rights." Felicity fell silent, apparently considering a new approach. Then she spoke in a different tone, harder, without the sweetness of before. "All right, Elmer. If you think you're right, why are you hiding at your neighbor's house? Why aren't you fighting for your home? Maybe because deep down, you know you're being selfish." That's the real Felicity. When persuasion doesn't work, aggression kicks in. I've seen it before. At family gatherings, when something didn't go according to her plan. Then the sweet smile would disappear, and it would become apparent what was hiding behind it. "I'm not hiding," I said calmly. "I'm temporarily staying with a friend until the court restores my rights." "Court! Court!" Felicity no longer concealed her irritation. "Aren't you ashamed to sue your own son? What will people think?" "Let them think that in America even old people have rights," I replied, "and that those rights are protected by the law." After that conversation, the call stopped for 2 days. I thought they had realized the futility of their attempts. But on the third day, Attorney Collins called. "Mr. Rigsby, your son has hired a lawyer. They've filed a motion to postpone the hearing, citing the need to prepare a defense." "What does that mean?" my son asked. "Nothing serious. It's a standard tactic to drag out the trial in the hope that you'll get tired and withdraw the suit. But the judge is unlikely to grant more than a week's delay." "What do they have to say for themselves?" "Not much under such obvious facts," replied Collins. "They'll probably plead family circumstances, or your consent, or some verbal agreement. But the documents speak for themselves." That evening, Colton called again. This time his voice was different. Not begging, but almost demanding. "Dad, do you realize what this is all about? I've had to hire a lawyer, spend money we don't have. And all for what? Your stubbornness?" "For justice," I corrected. "And the money you spend on a lawyer is of your own choosing. No one's forcing you to." "Of course they are. You sued." After you kicked me out of the house. Cause and effect, son. Don't confuse the two. Colton was silent for a moment, then spoke more softly. Dad, I'm going to ask you one last time. Why don't we settle out of court after all? I'll find you a nice apartment. Pay for the move, the first month's rent. You'll get all the amenities and we'll solve the Juniper problem. And then what? I asked. When someone else in your family has a problem, will you come to me again with demands? There won't be any more situations like that. How can you be sure? Juniper's already failed to get her life together once. What guarantees that the same thing won't happen again a year from now? Colton didn't have an answer. I realized he hadn't thought about it himself. His plan was to solve the current problem at any cost, and what happened next didn't matter. A definitive no, then? He asked at last. Final, I confirmed. Then I'll see you in court, Colton said and disconnected. They didn't call again. The court hearing was set for 10 o'clock Monday morning. I woke up at 6:30 and couldn't go back to sleep. My nerves were getting the best of me. Outside the window, it was gloomy November weather, drizzling light rain, the wind bending the branches of the trees. The weather suited my mood just fine. Cora was up early and had prepared a hearty breakfast of scrambled eggs and bacon, toast, and coffee. She understood that I needed strength for the challenge ahead, though I could eat almost nothing. There was an uneasy feeling in my stomach that comes before important events. Elmer, are you sure you don't want me to come with you? She asked, pouring me a second cup of coffee. Thank you, Cora, but I'd rather handle it alone, I replied. This is a family matter, and outsiders have no business being there. But I'm your witness, aren't I? I saw what was going on this morning when they evicted you. Collins said there's no need for witnesses yet. The documents speak for themselves. I dressed in my best suit, the dark blue one I'd bought for Colton's wedding 5 years ago. Since then, I'd only worn it to funerals and formal events. I put on the tie Ruth had given me for my birthday. She'd always said blue looked good on me. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw a 74-year-old man with gray hair, tired eyes, but a straight back. The years were taking their toll, but it was too soon to give up. I arrived at the courthouse half an hour before the appointed time. It was an old brick building with columns built in the 30s of the last century. The steps were wet with rain, and I climbed up carefully, holding on to the railing. The lobby smelled like old wood and clerical work, and people were walking around with folders and documents, talking quietly. Blaine Collins was already waiting for me at the entrance to the conference room. He was in a strict black suit with a leather briefcase in his hand, looking confident and professional. How are you, Mr. Rigsby? He asked, shaking my hand. Ready? Ready, I replied, even though I didn't feel ready at all. Remember what I said. Answer questions clearly and to the point. Don't let your emotions get the best of you. Even if something gets you down, the judge appreciates restraint. We entered the courtroom. It was a large room with high ceilings, wood paneling on the walls, and rows of public benches. In the center were tables for the plaintiff and defendant, and in front rows the judge's chair. The atmosphere was solemn and a little intimidating. Colton was already seated at the defendant's table with his attorney, a young woman with glasses and a strict suit. Next to him was Juniper in a black dress that had obviously been bought especially for the trial. Felicity wasn't there. Apparently they'd decided it was better to avoid unnecessary witnesses. As I passed their table, Colton raised his head and looked at me. His eyes were a mixture of hurt, anger, and something else, maybe disappointment. He looked tired, gaunt, like he hadn't slept well in days. He was wearing the same suit he'd gotten married in, but it didn't fit right now. I nodded at him, but he turned away, not returning the greeting. At 10:00, the judge entered the room, a woman in her 50s with short gray hair and a stern face. Everyone stood up. She sat down in her chair and declared the meeting open. The case is being heard on the suit of Elmer Rigsby against Colton Rigsby and Juniper McPhee for restoration of the infringed right of possession and use of the dwelling, she read from the papers. Plaintiff seeks a declaration that it is unlawful to deprive him of access to the home he owns and to order the defendants to vacate the premises. Collins stood up and laid out the case. He spoke clearly and persuasively, citing documents, explaining the chronology of events. Colton's attorney, her name was Sarah McGregor, listened attentively, occasionally taking notes. Your Honor, Collins said in closing, The documents unequivocally establish my client's ownership of the disputed dwelling. The defendants have arbitrarily deprived him of access to the property, which is a gross violation of the law. The judge nodded and turned to the defendant's attorney. Ms. McGregor, state the defense position. Colton's attorney stood up. She was young in her early 30s, but she held herself with confidence. Your Honor, the defense does not dispute the plaintiff's ownership of the house. However, the circumstances of the case are far more complicated than the plaintiff's presence. My client, Colton Rigsby, acted in good faith in an attempt to help a family in a critical situation. She began to talk about Juniper's hardship, the children in the motel, the fact that the house was empty and people needed a place to live. Talked about family obligations, about Colton counting on his father's understanding. My client had no intent to harm the plaintiff, McGregor continued. He envisioned a temporary placement for the family with a negotiated housing solution to follow. The judge listened silently, but I could see in her face that the defense's arguments were not impressing her. Good intentions do not justify breaking the law. Do the defendants have documentation that the plaintiff has agreed to provide housing? She asked. No, Your Honor, McGregor acknowledged, but between relatives, many issues are resolved on the basis of trust and understanding. In this case, there was no trust and understanding, the judge observed dryly. Plaintiff, do you wish to testify? I stood up and walked over to the deposition area, swore an oath to tell the truth and only the truth. Collins asked me several questions about how events unfolded, whether I had consented to Juniper moving in, whether I knew of my son's plans. No, I answered clearly. I categorically refused my son's offer and made my position clear. My consent was not and could not have been given. Colton's attorney tried to unhinge me. Mr. Rigsby, don't you feel a moral obligation to help a family with children? Moral obligations and legal rights are different things, I replied. No one can force me to give charity at the expense of violating my rights. But this is your family we're talking about. Juniper McPhee is not a member of my family. It's a relative of my son's wife. McGregor tried to paint me as a callous egotist, but I answered calmly and matter-of-factly. Collins objected several times to improper questions, and the judge sustained his objections. Colton and Juniper then testified. The son recounted his motives and tried to portray what had happened as a misunderstanding. He said he was counting on my understanding, that he didn't mean to hurt me. I thought my father would understand the situation and agree to help, he said. After all, the house is big and he lives alone. Did you and your father discuss the possibility of changing the locks? The judge asked. No, I thought it was a temporary security measure. Security from whom? Colton faltered, realizing he'd backed himself into a corner. Safety from his own father sounded absurd. Juniper talked about her problems, cried, talked about her children. She was a good actress, but the judge was hard to be led by emotion. The facts remained facts. After the testimony, the judge called a recess to review the documents. Collins and I went out into the hallway. The lawyer was pleased. It's going well. They don't have any arguments other than emotional ones. In the hallway, I saw Colton standing by the window alone. Juniper and his lawyer were talking about something off to the side. The sun was looking out at the rainy street and looked depressed. I walked over to him. Colton. He turned around. There was pain and hurt in his eyes. Are you satisfied? He asked quietly. Humiliated your own son in front of strangers? You humiliated yourself when you broke the law, I replied. I'm just restoring justice. Justice? He grinned bitterly. You're destroying a family for the sake of your stubbornness. The family was destroyed by you when you kicked me out of the house. We looked at each other, and I realized that the gulf between us had become unbridgeable. He saw me as a selfish old man, and I saw him as an ungrateful son. There would be no reconciliation. You know what, Dad? Colton said slowly. After the trial, you're going to get your house back, and you're going to live there alone for the rest of your days, all alone. It was a threat, and I understood it. He promised never to speak to me again. If that's the price for respecting my rights, so be it, I replied. Colton nodded, as if I had confirmed his worst expectations, and retreated to his attorney. The hearing resumed. The judge reviewed all the documents and listened to the parties' closing arguments. Collins was brief and persuasive. McGregor tried one last time to play on emotion, but to no avail. The court withdraws for deliberation, the judge announced. The meeting lasted only 15 minutes. When the judge returned, there was silence in the room. "Stand up, the court is in session," announced the clerk. The judge read out the decision. The claim is satisfied in full. The defendants are obliged within 3 days to vacate the disputed premises and reimburse the plaintiff for court costs. A fine and forced eviction are stipulated for failure to fulfill the decision. I felt relief and emptiness at the same time. Justice had been served, but at what cost? Colton stood up and, without looking in my direction, headed for the exit. Juniper was crying, his lawyer explaining something to her about appeal deadlines. But I knew they weren't going to appeal anything. The case was too obvious. "Congratulations," Colin said. "Justice has been served." Yes, justice. Only why did it feel so hard on my soul? The day after the trial, I woke up feeling strangely empty. Legally, the case had been won, but it did not bring mental satisfaction. Cora tactfully didn't ask about the details of the trial, only asked about the outcome. When I said that I had won, she nodded with relief, but she did not express her joy either. She had seen my state of mind. After breakfast, I decided to drive over to the house and see what was going on. According to the court order, Colton and Juniper had 3 days to vacate the premises, but I hoped they wouldn't stall until the last minute. After all, a court order wasn't just a piece of paper, but an official document that could get you into serious trouble if you didn't comply with it. When I pulled up to my house, there were 2 cars in the yard, the blue Colton pickup and the old gray sedan that Juniper drove in. The front door was open, and from there came voices and the sounds of furniture being moved. I parked in front of Cora's house next door and watched. Colton was taking boxes and suitcases out and putting them in the back of a pickup truck. His movements were sharp, angry. Apparently, the defeat in court had been hard on him. There was a grim determination on his face of a man who was doing an unpleasant job, but wanted to get it over with as quickly as possible. Juniper fussed around the car, shifting things around, searching through bags. The children were sitting on the porch steps with droopy faces, apparently not very happy about the prospect of another move. The girl was leafing through a book. The boy was playing with a toy car, but they both looked depressed. Felicity came out of the house with a box in her hands. She was talking to Colton about something, but the distance made it impossible to make out the words. It was clear from her gesticulations that the conversation was tense. Colton waved his hand several times, indicating that he did not want to discuss the subject, but Felicity insisted. The loading went on for about an hour. In that time, they took out a surprising amount of stuff. I hadn't realized Juniper had so many possessions. Several suitcases, boxes of children's toys, household supplies, even a small TV. Apparently, they'd had time to settle in during the days they've been living in my house. When the loading was done, Juniper walked over to the children and said something to them. The children reluctantly got up and walked to the car. The girl looked back at the house with regret. She must have liked living in a big house instead of a cramped motel. Colton and Felicity stood by the porch and continued their conversation. I could see their faces now, and the expressions were not pleasant. Felicity was talking fast, waving her arms around. Colton was listening with a stone face. At one point, he said something sharply, and Felicity recoiled as if she'd been slapped. Juniper started the car and drove slowly out of the yard. At the last second, the boy leaned out of the window and waved toward the house, apparently saying goodbye to the place that had briefly become his home. I felt a pang of regret. The kids really weren't guilty of anything. They were just hostage to adult problems. After Juniper left, Colton and Felicity were left alone. Their conversation became even more tense. Felicity was proving something, pointing her finger in the direction of the house, then in the direction of the car that drove away. Colton shook his head, shrugged. At one point, he turned and walked toward his pickup, but Felicity caught up with him and grabbed his sleeve. They argued for another minute, then Colton abruptly released himself from her grip and got into the car. Felicity remained standing on the porch as he drove away. She stood there for a few more minutes, staring after the vanished pickup truck, then pulled out her cell phone and called someone. I didn't eavesdrop on her conversation. Instead, I walked over to the house and looked around the outside. It looked normal from the outside, no damage, no debris in the yard. Colton, despite all his faults, is a decent man and didn't vandalize the place. Felicity finished talking on the phone and noticed me. She walked up to the wicket, her face tearful and angry at the same time. Happy? She asked sharply. I'm just checking the condition of my property, I replied calmly. Property? She snorted. Yes, you can enjoy your property all by yourself now. It's my choice, I said. Choice? Felicity laughed, but the laugh was evil. You destroyed your family, and you call that a choice? I looked at her carefully. Felicity looked different than usual. Usually she was neatly combed, wearing makeup, dressed tastefully. Now her hair was disheveled, her makeup smeared with tears, and she was dressed in crumpled jeans and an old sweatshirt. Apparently the last few days hadn't been easy for her. It wasn't me who ruined the family, I replied. The family was destroyed by someone who decided to kick my father out of the house for strangers. Strangers? Felicity burst out. Juniper is my sister. They're not strangers. Strangers to me, I said simply, and my house is not a shelter for all your family's relatives. Felicity looked at me with hatred. Her eyes read not just disappointment, but real anger. Apparently the collapse of her plans had hit her ego harder than I'd realized. You know what? She said slowly. Colton was right all along. I shouldn't have been ceremonious with you. I should have just confronted you, and that's it. So that's exactly what you did, I remarked. Not fully done, she replied angrily. I should have left you no room for complaints in courts. It sounded like a threat, and I felt uneasy. It appeared that Felicity was sorry, not that they had done me an injustice, but that they hadn't done it decisively enough. Felicity, do you realize what you're saying? I asked. I understand perfectly, she lifted her chin. I realize I've wasted 3 years of my life trying to have a relationship with a man who thinks only of himself. I think about upholding the law, I corrected. About the law, she laughed hysterically. Do you think about family, about children, about people who need help? I think, but not at the expense of violating their rights. Felicity was silent for a moment, then spoke more softly, but it made her words sound even more ominous. Do you know where Juniper and the children are now? That's none of my business, Hyunmi replied. She went to visit her aunt in Alabama, 800 miles from here. To a small town with no decent schools, no jobs, no future. Felicity spoke, looking me in the eye. The kids will grow up in poverty because they weren't given a chance here. They were given a chance, but not at my expense, I said firmly. At your expense, she exploded. At the expense of a lonely old man who lives in a huge house and won't share it with anyone. Sharing and giving are different things, I objected. You didn't want temporary help. You wanted me to make room for your relatives forever. Felicity didn't bother to argue with this statement. Apparently it was true. She was really counting on me obediently moving into the apartment and no longer interfering with their plans. You know what? She said finally. Let it be as you want it to be. Live in your house by yourself, but don't count on Colton forgiving you for what you did to him. What I did to him, I wondered. Defended his rights in court? Humiliated him publicly, forced him to justify himself to strangers, showed the whole town that he's a bad son. Felicity listed my crimes with the fervor of a prosecutor. He showed he was a bad son himself when he kicked his father out of the house, I replied. I was just doing him justice. Justice! She laughed again. Your justice cost us everything. Colton spent the money we were saving for a down payment on a house on lawyers. Now we're going to have to rent for a few more years. So that was it. So it wasn't just about a noble desire to help her sister. If their plan worked, if I dutifully moved out and sold the house, Colton and Felicity would get a cut of the sale, or counted on me to gift them the house in my lifetime. You were counting on getting my house? I asked bluntly. Felicity looked embarrassed, but not for long. We were counting on you to act like a normal father. Help your son get back on his feet instead of clinging to real estate you don't need. Unnecessary? I couldn't believe my ears. This is my house where I've lived for 40 years. Too big for one person, Felicity retorted. And you know it very well. There she was, the real Felicity, not the kindly sister-in-law who worried about her poor sister, but the calculating woman who saw my house as the source of the solution to her financial problems. The sister was only an excuse. The real goal was to get me to part with the property. I see now, I said. Juniper was only an excuse. What you really wanted was my house. Felicity realized she'd blundered and tried to make amends. Not your house, but to help your family. Colton is your only son. He needs support. Colton is a grown man. He can provide for himself, I replied. Nani, and if he can't, that's his problem, not mine. Felicity looked at me in disgust. Now I see why Colton is so angry with you. You really are a callous egomaniac. She turned and walked to her car, which was parked at the edge of the yard. I followed her with a glance, feeling strangely relieved. At last the mask had dropped and everything was falling into place. No concern for the poor children, no family duty. Only banal greed and the desire to get rich at someone else's expense. Felicity started the car and drove off without even saying goodbye. I was left standing in the yard of my house, which was finally mine again.